How much seam allowance do you need when sewing a fursuit? Does the amount you need change if you're using a sewing machine? Why would a pre-made fursuit need more seam allowance than a personal suit? Those questions and more answered in this video. But first, what is seam allowance? Seam allowance is the fabric between your sewing line and the edge of the fabric. This extra bit of fabric serves multiple functions, including it helps you control your fabric pieces as you sew, ensures that those fabric pieces are caught by your stitches, and if your fabric is fragile, your seam allowance gives you room to sew, allowing that delicate raw edge to stay intact. Now that we know what it is, how much seam allowance should you use? Consider these 3 factors. First, room to tailor. If you have a desire to tailor your fursuit in the future, you want to use a large seam allowance. Wedding dresses are often constructed with large seam allowances, sometimes upwards of 2 inches. The extra material in the seam allows a wedding dress to be let out or expanded to fit the bride's shape. If you are making a pre-made fursuit, or just want to make sure that you can tailor your fursuit in the future, you might want to include a large seam allowance so you have material to work with. It might look small, but an extra inch in the side and back seams of a fursuit torso means that you can later increase that measurement by 3 inches if needed. Second, placement. Fursuit heads often have very short fur, especially around the nose, eyes, and muzzle. A large seam allowance, like I described previously, would create a hump, making the seam very visible. This is why I often use a seam allowance that is as small as possible in these areas. Yes, you can trim down the seam allowance after construction, but that's extra labor, wrist strain, and wasted material. If I can, I'd like to avoid that, so I use a seam allowance of 1/4 inch or smaller on the entire fursuit head. Previously, when I would hand sew my fursuit heads, I wouldn't use a seam allowance at all. I would sew as close to the edge of the fabric as possible, since the knit backing of most faux fur isn't prone to fraying, and the slight stretch of the fabric would allow my pattern to still fit my base. And the final factor to consider when choosing your seam allowance: experience. There's nothing wrong with being inexperienced. We all start somewhere after all, so if you saw that last example of me sewing the fursuit head and got a little intimidated, it's totally okay to use a large seam allowance. A large seam allowance can allow you to feel more in control of your sewing, and you can just cut the seam allowance down afterwards. That's totally okay, and over time you can use a smaller and smaller seam allowance. Machine sewing saves your time and body, and if you need to use a 2-inch seam allowance to feel comfortable using your sewing machine, you should. There's no wrong way to construct a fursuit, and a large seam allowance doesn't make your finished project less impressive or beautiful. So how much seam allowance should you use? However much you'd like. I hope that helped. Thanks for watching.